You are standing in the dark. Not the soft dark of a bedroom with curtains drawn. Not the comfortable dark you have known your whole life. This is the other kind. The kind that has weight. The kind that presses against your chest and makes your lungs work harder than they should. You came here because you didn't believe. Because you needed to prove something. Because somewhere in the back of your mind, the idea that something older and angrier than you might actually be watching, that idea made you feel small. And you have never been able to tolerate feeling small. There is no wind tonight, but the candle just lit itself. And behind you, in the dark you were so sure was empty, something is already standing there. His name was Daniel Marsh, and he had never once in 34 years of living been the kind of man who apologized for what he thought. He wore his skepticism the way other men wore expensive watches, openly, deliberately, as a signal to the room. He had grown up in Tucson, Arizona, the son of a quiet Pakistani-American mother who kept old prayers folded in her wallet, and a father who thought organized belief of any kind was a product being sold to people who couldn't handle uncertainty. Daniel had inherited his father's certainty and his mother's curiosity, which made him exactly the kind of person who walked into strange places without fear and walked out with stories he could use. He was a contributing writer for a mid-sized cultural magazine based out of Chicago, the kind of publication that paid modestly but carried enough credibility that Daniel could point to his byline at dinner parties and watch people nod with something close to respect. He covered fringe religion, folk belief, urban mythology. Places where the rational world ended and something older and stranger began. Not because he believed in any of it. Because his readers found it fascinating the way people find a car wreck fascinating. Unable to look away from something they would never want to touch. He had been on the road for 3 weeks working a feature about sites in the American South and Southwest that locals treated as genuinely sacred, not in a formal religious sense but in the older sense. Places where something had happened, or was believed to have happened, that rewrote the emotional geography of an entire community. He had been to a crossroads in Mississippi that old men in a diner refused to name out loud. He had stood in a canyon in New Mexico where a ranger told him, quietly and without drama, that the GPS systems of search and rescue helicopters failed reliably within a specific half-mile radius for reasons that had never been explained. He had filed those stories with the same dry, slightly amused detachment he brought to everything. He was not afraid. He was observing. His last stop was a small town in central Tennessee called Harrow Creek. Population under 2,000. A former mill town with a decommissioned fort on its eastern edge that dated to the late 1700s. The fort had fallen into partial ruin over the following centuries, and the town had never fully decided what to do with it. It had been a state historic site for a while. Then funding dried up. Now it sat on a parcel of overgrown land maintained by a county historical society that was mostly one 70-year-old woman named Ruth, and who sent strongly worded emails to the local government every few months and otherwise left the place alone. What Daniel had read about the fort in his pre-trip research was sparse but interesting. Local accounts going back at least 150 years described the site as a place where something had taken up residence that was not connected to any specific religion or tradition but was acknowledged by nearly every community that had ever lived near it. The original Cherokee who had watched the fort be built on land they considered permanently off-limits, the settlers who built it anyway and then quietly stopped using the site for certain nighttime gatherings after a series of incidents that were never formally documented, and the black families who had farmed the surrounding land for generations after the Civil War and who, according to the older residents Daniel had managed to reach by phone, had their own very specific and consistent rules about what you did not do near the old fort after sunset. His contact in Harrow Creek was a man named Roy who ran the hardware store on the main road and had agreed to give Daniel an informal tour in exchange for being mentioned in the article. Roy was 62, heavy-set, and had the careful manner of someone who had grown up being taught that certain topics required a particular tone. Not fearful, not theatrical. just respectful. The way you talked about a river that had drowned people. Roy picked Daniel up at the bed and breakfast at 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday. The drive to the fort took 12 minutes. Roy spent most of them describing the physical layout of the site. He did not embellish. He did not tell Daniel what to expect. At one point Daniel said with genuine curiosity, "You don't actually believe any of this, do you? The stuff about the site." Roy looked at the road for a moment before answering. "I believe there are things that have been true for a very long time," he said. "And that when something has been true for that long, the smart move is to treat it like it's still true until you've got a real good reason not to." Daniel wrote that down. The fort itself was less dramatic than he'd expected. Low stone walls partially collapsed in 2 places, overgrown with scrub cedar and tall grass. There was a low, arched opening in the eastern wall that led into an interior courtyard that had once held a barracks and a small administrative building, both long gone. What remained was mostly the outer walls, a series of stone support columns that had once held the barracks roof, and along the northern wall, a series of recessed alcoves cut directly into the stone, about 18 inches deep, each roughly the shape of a standing person. There were things left in the alcoves. Not trash, not graffiti, things placed, deliberately, folded pieces of paper, small candles, some burned down to, stubs, some newer, photographs in plastic sleeves, a child's sock, weathered, tied around a smooth stone, a handwritten note sealed in a mason jar. Roy stood a few feet back while Daniel examined them, not touching anything, taking photos with his phone. "Who leaves these?" Daniel asked. "People who need something," Roy said simply. "People who've tried everything else." Daniel took more photos. He noted and found mildly interesting that the offerings came from what appeared to be multiple faith traditions or from no recognizable tradition at all. That specificity was good for the article. He filed it mentally under the heading of folk syncretism and moved on. As they were leaving, Roy stopped at the arched opening and turned to Daniel with the same careful, level manner he had used throughout the afternoon. "I'm going to say one thing," Roy said, "and I'm not going to explain it or argue for it. You can do whatever you want with it." He paused. "Do not come back here tonight." Daniel smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." Roy nodded once. He already knew Daniel was coming back. Daniel returned at 11:45 that night with his phone fully charged, a small handheld voice recorder, and the particular alertness that came from knowing he was doing something he had been specifically told not to do. He parked on the county road and walked the quarter-mile to the site through a field that smelled of cut grass and something older underneath it, something damp and mineral that he couldn't name. The fort was completely silent. Not the regular silence of an outdoor space at night, which always has texture, always has the movement of insects and small animals and wind in grass. This silence was different. It was the silence of a held breath. The silence of a room where everyone has stopped talking at the same moment for a reason no one wants to acknowledge. He entered through the arched opening. His phone light showed the same stone columns, the same alcoves along the northern wall. The candles were still there. All of them were lit. Daniel stopped. He had been here 5 hours ago. There had been no wind. No one else had been here when he left. He told himself the Historical Society must send someone out in the evenings. He took photos. He told himself the explanation was obvious. He was moving along the northern wall, photographing the alcoves, when he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, deliberate, the crunch of dry grass underfoot. He turned around. The courtyard was empty. He stood still and listened. Nothing. He turned back to the wall. The footsteps started again. He spun around fast this time. Still nothing. But something was different. The candles in the alcoves nearest to him had gone out. Not all of them, just the 3 closest to where he was standing. The ones further along the wall were still burning. Like whatever had extinguished them had moved toward him and stopped directly behind him and was simply standing there, and he had not had the courage to turn around quickly enough to see it. Daniel's hands were cold. He noticed this distantly as information. He turned back to the wall and made himself speak out loud. Lightly, the way he spoke to himself when he was alone in his apartment and wanted to hear a human voice. "Okay," he said. "Old building. Drafts. I get it." He laughed once, short and automatic. It sounded wrong in the silence. Too small. Like a noise made in a room where the walls are closer than they appear. He pressed on. He moved toward the far end of the northern wall, where the largest alcove sat, wider than the others, set deeper into the stone. There was more in this one than the others. More letters. More candles. In the center of the alcove, placed on a flat stone that had clearly been used as a surface for years, was a glass jar. Inside the jar was a piece of paper with handwriting on it. And next to the jar, placed with an intentionality that was impossible to miss, was a small photograph. Daniel leaned in to see the photograph more clearly. He stopped breathing. The photograph was of him, standing at this exact alcove, taken from roughly 12 feet away, taken from the angle of light sometime in the late afternoon, taken today. While Roy stood behind him and said nothing, Daniel ran. Not the careful jog of someone who feels uncertain, the full, thoughtless sprint of someone whose body has decided before their mind catches up. He ran across the courtyard toward the arched exit. His phone light swung in all directions. The shadows moved with it and against it simultaneously. The footsteps returned. Not behind him now, but around him on multiple sides, matching his speed exactly. He hit the arched opening at full speed and burst through into the field outside and ran without stopping until he reached the county road. He stood at his car with his hands on his knees for almost 2 full minutes before he could breathe normally. He looked back at the fort. He could still see the faint glow of the candles through the arched opening. Every single one of them burning. But there was something else. Something standing just inside the arch at the threshold, not stepping through. A shape that had the general proportion of a person but was assembled from the darkness in a way that living things are not. Not moving. Not approaching. Simply present in the way that very old things are present in places that belong to them. Patient, permanent, uninterested in whether or not you believe. It was looking at him. Daniel did not look away. He understood, in the specific and wordless way that the body sometimes understands things before the mind gets there, that looking away was the wrong choice. That the only safe thing was to hold its attention, which was also the most terrifying thing, while he reached for his car door and opened it and sat down and started the engine and drove. He drove for 40 minutes without stopping. When he finally pulled over at an all-night gas station, he sat in the car for a long time. He checked his phone. He had taken 47 photos inside the fort. He opened the gallery. The first 36 photos were normal. Stone walls. Candle alcoves. Details. Then in photo 37, his phone light had clearly been pointed at the northern wall, and the image was mostly shadow with the glow of a candle on the left edge. And in the center of the frame, in the space between 2 columns, was a shape. The shape of a person who had no reason to be there. Not Roy. Not Daniel. Taller than either of them. Standing in the exact posture of something that has been waiting in one place for a very long time and is entirely comfortable continuing to do so. Daniel deleted the photo immediately. He couldn't explain why. Felt like the right thing to do. Like removing yourself from a conversation you were never meant to be part of. He did not publish the article about Harrow Creek. He filed the other stories, the Mississippi Crossroads, the New Mexico Canyon, and told his editor the Tennessee piece didn't come together. His editor accepted this without question. He drove back through Harrow Creek the following morning to return the key to the bed and breakfast. He stopped at Roy's hardware store. Roy was behind the counter. He looked up when Daniel came in, unsurprised. "How'd it go?" Roy asked. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment. "You knew I was going back." "Yes." "The photograph in the jar," Daniel said. "Who took it?" Roy was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know who leaves what in those alcoves," he said carefully. "I just know that whatever's in that fort has been there a long time, and it pays attention." He looked at Daniel steadily. "Did you lose anything?" Daniel thought about the deleted photo. He thought about the shape in the arch. He thought about the thing he felt now that he had not felt before. A faint, persistent awareness, like a sound just below the threshold of hearing, that something was still watching, that it had followed his attention back to him the way a thread follows a needle. "I don't think so," Daniel said. Roy nodded slowly. "Then you got off easy. Here is what I want to tell you about Daniel Marsh, now that the story is technically over. He still writes for the magazine. He still covers fringe religion and folk belief and places where the rational world gets thin. He is still skeptical. He will tell you that himself. He has a way of framing the Harrow Creek experience that makes it sound, if you are not listening carefully, like nothing more than a strange night and a coincidental photograph and a case of nerves in an unfamiliar place. But there are things he has changed. He does not enter unfamiliar sacred sites after dark anymore. He does not mock what he doesn't understand in the places where that understanding lives. He listens more when the people who have known a place for a long time tell him something is true, not because he is certain they are right, but because he is no longer certain they are wrong. There is a version of bravery that is actually just a refusal to take things seriously, that wears its own arrogance as a kind of armor. Daniel Marsh had that armor for 34 years, and it worked fine, right up until the night something in an old stone fort in Tennessee looked at him across a dark field and didn't move and didn't threaten and didn't have to. Because the most unsettling thing about that shape in the archway was not that it was there. It was how long it had been there before he noticed, and how long it may have been watching before that night, before that town. Some places carry memory the way stone carries cold, deep, patient, indifferent to whether or not you can feel it. You walk in, you take your photos, you tell yourself you are observing something from the outside. But there is no outside. There is only inside, and the question of whether whatever lives there has decided you are worth acknowledging. Daniel Marsh was worth acknowledging. He thinks about that more than he would like to admit. And on the nights when the house is quiet and the sleep won't come, he thinks about the photograph that was already there when he arrived. The one taken in afternoon light. The one that proved that whatever watched him that night had been watching long before he decided, in the comfortable certainty of his own disbelief, that there was nothing there to see. It knew he was coming. It was already ready.